Right. Okay. Recording has begun. Welcome back, everybody. It is an honor, a pleasure to welcome my good friend, my comrade, my co-conspirator, Eric Stanley, to this gathering. As you all know, this project, this experiment began as a graduate seminar in this department I'm in at UC Riverside called Media Cultural Studies. It's a graduate seminar I teach here. Decided to open it up, make this a wonderful open experiment. I think it's flowing really well. And we have Eric here as the first person participating in a sequence of experimental study for the fall that started last year, actually. It's called On Violence, Experimental Study Sequence. We have no format. We have no script. I explicitly tell all our guests to not prepare a damn thing. I want them to come and just talk with you, think with you, and speculate with you. So Eric, I will just say, is one of the people, one of the precious people who I really just dearly respect, who I know would be a co-conspirator in virtually any project and probably push me to my political and practical limits. So I really cherish my relationship with Eric, and I cherish Eric's mind, as well as Eric's praxis. So Eric, that's where we're going with this. We're going to be thinking about we're going to be thinking about your book and thinking about your larger body of praxis, the things you do. That's where folks were interested in moving, especially given what you write about. And I'll let you know too that the first half of this class, before you joined us, one of our co-facilitators actually had us watch about a 5 or 6 minute clip of Sylvia giving that raging speech to the crowd. So that was really beautiful. I think I'd seen it once before, but I hadn't seen it in a long time. So I really appreciated that. So when we publish this video, I'll make sure to put that Vimeo link in the chat for folks that might be watching this after it's been recorded, so y'all can see it yourselves. But with that, Eric, do you mind just introducing yourself in whatever way you want to?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dylan, for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. It's very exciting that there's 80 people sitting here. Surprise to me. But yeah, that's very rad. And I'm not very good at following directions, but the direction to not prepare, I did follow. And so here I am, down to think with y'all in whatever capacity seems useful or interesting or whatever. So yeah, but thanks a lot for showing up and spending some time with us.
Outstanding. All right, Joe, we have 70 minutes with Eric Stanley. So I'm going to open up to our co-facilitators to kind of kick things off and catalyze things. Folks that are coming through, as you start thinking about questions and thoughts, etc., don't hesitate to put them in chat. But I'm going to do my best to facilitate. But if there's anything you wanted to raise with Eric, please don't hesitate to raise your digital hand, and I will get to you as soon as I can. Apologies in advance for every person who I cannot get to before the end of our session together. But please do go ahead, raise your digital hand whenever you want, and I'll get to you after we do this kind of initial round of thinking that's catalyzed by our co-facilitator. So I'm going to ask Kim to introduce themselves and to bring forward a really great question about reflexivity that came up in their kind of initial opening provocations around your work. So Kim, if you're here, I'd love it if you would start us off with that.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan. Hi, Eric. Good to see you. I'm Kim. I use she, they pronouns. I am a graduate student, staff at the Southern California Library, and I organized with sex workers against gentrification in LA. So we read your beautiful and amazing book, Atmospheres of Violence, and had a lot to think about and talk through. I think one of the things that we've been struggling with, and I'll speak for myself and people who also see themselves as part of already trying to be ungovernable, right? Or like our bodies being read as ungovernable already. Uh, how do you work through or struggle with reflexivity when trying to be accountable to the affirma of attack that you use as method and as an archive, right? Um, and this is really important, I think, to us as a lot of us are, in the academy. I'm sure not part of it, but still connected to it in some sort of way and want to use our resources and skill sets, right, to interrupt the process of like elite knowledge making. So these conversations, I think, come from Joy James's conversations around, right, not being the representative of culture for the academic industrial complex. And we're really curious as to how you wrestle with that as a person who is in community with folks, and also, right, an author of a book published by Duke. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Nice to see you go. Nice to see you. Sorry, the P as well. I've gotten out of my Zoom habit, so I'm trying to figure it out. But yeah, very nice to see you. Big fan of your work as well. So that's a really important and necessarily unanswerable question to myself. All I can do is hold it as I attempt to struggle with lots of other people. I think that the first order of negative failure is when we think that we have an answer to it. That this constitutes the, this choice versus this choice constitutes the ethical passage out of the hell that we're in, right? Like to not do this or to do this or to hyper exceptionalize ourselves. Like I'm a public school teacher. I don't, it's like not actually that interesting. But there's a way that we kind of get bound up or wound up in the idea that it's like this hyper specialized profession. We make way less than most nonprofit executive directors, so we can think about that. And all those contradictions, while also knowing like that certain kind of cultural space that we own, that we inhabit, and certain kinds of resources that we might have available. So I think to your point, like how might we be able to extract as many of those resources and redistribute them while, yeah. So I think that's one part of it. And I also think, and the reality is that I'm sure everyone on this call and most of the people that we're in community with operate in a lot of different registers, right? The thing that we're doing here might look really different than the thing that we do with our friends when we're organizing or might do on the streets might also be really different. And I think that is good. And I think, the advice that I always have for well, I never have advice, but when people ask me this, the only thing I can say is that, having some separation between the world that you want and what you do to survive is necessary and good. Of course, there's interventions that I try to make in my workplace, but that has never been my primary scene of struggle or where I build most of my community. It's a place that exists in actually a different county than I live. So I live in San Francisco and I don't live in Berkeley. And so all of that seems important, not because it offers me, again, an escape route, but it might, keep me steady enough, keep us steady enough to try to do something different. And I think that this is one of those examples of us trying to do something different, like kind of in the cracks as it's all happening. Yeah, and so I think that, holding those contradictions, showing the seams as opposed to like trying to paper over them seems really important to me. Not hyper, I don't know, not spectacularizing our own place in all of this, right? Knowing our own deep expendability to this machine. I mean, the quickness with which they would throw us all, not metaphorically, but literally under the bus, should not be lost on any of us at any of the different stages, if this might be the place that we work. Yeah, so I think that, those are some of my preliminary thoughts. I think because so much of my not this life or not the work life is mostly with some people on this call that I organize with that doesn't actually intersect very much with the university, that it's not something that like really pains me. And I think that is one way that I try to get through it. I don't know. So no answers, but a bunch more questions.
Yeah, Eric, like part of the discussion that we were having in preparation for your visit raised this question or raised this point for me, which is, you've heard me talk about it before, which is drawing a necessary distinction between praxis, scholarship, research, thought, teaching, the good shit we do, and the aspirational colonial position of the academic, and the aspirational archival and epistemological monopoly that is the so-called academy, right? That if we understand those things as aspirational, then and I didn't say this before to our study group, but I think if we understand those things as aspirational, you can actually refuse the aspiration. At the same time, you have an employment relationship, right? So you have an employment relationship with the university. I like that Eric referred to this, like we are actually public school teachers. At best, by the way. like that's what we are at best, right? In other ways, we could be basically public university bureaucrats or an extension of public university police, right? So like that's the position that university employed faculty have. In particular, I would say if they conflate their employment with the aspirational position of being an academic. Like I think that there's something that happens in that embrace of the aspiration that is I think irredeemably colonial, and other things. But this opening point from Kim makes me think of kind of a conjoined question about the circulation, audience, the project of the book, alongside the concept of overkill. So Anais was one of our other co-facilitators. Anais, can I ask you to articulate that question, that point, that dilemma for Eric, and then maybe think with Eric on that?
Yes. Hi, my name is Anais. I use they, them pronouns. And yeah, I am a queer person, another queer person reading your book. And in reading it, I'm a musician, and it's like this class is like one of my first deeper dives into more theoretical scholarly writings. I've been more like musician in praxis, trying to use music as a way to resist and for organizing and for protest. And so this is a new context for me. And as I was reading it, I'm grateful to say I learned about 18 new words as I read your book. And was also wondering, who is this book for? And also in that with the term overkill, which I think is one that stood out to me the most, especially as you gave these really vivid descriptions of violence that honestly was some of the most captivating writing I've ever read. In my suffering and in my crying, as I read through those passages, I was very captivated as well. So I'm curious, I guess it's kind of a two-part question of how does understanding or your concept of overkill, how does that help us in any way? How does this new word help us? And who is this book for? And maybe these two questions can kind of dialogue with each other.
Cool. So nice to meet you. And thank you for that question. Who's this book for? So, I guess I could go backwards. So interestingly enough, and I say this all the time because it continues to be true, the two groups of people that send me the most feedback or talk to me the most about this book are incarcerated people that have been doing a bunch of different study groups with it. And I'm going to put profits in parentheses because, a book like this might make like $2,000 or something like that. But anyway, all that money goes into getting copies for free to people inside. So my author's profits. So I have a lot of communication with different study groups in a bunch of different states that have used it in their own classrooms or their own self-formed study groups. So that's been really interesting. And also high school debate people, for some reason, are really into this book. And so and all that is to say, right, people that so oftentimes a book like this, the charge will get levied against it that the people can't understand it. Again, that's in quotation marks. And of course, we're all working in different levels of abstraction, and what might be interesting to us might not be interesting to someone else, et cetera, et cetera. So we can never know in advance, who's going to constitute an audience. I always think any kind of text or music or book or anything produces an audience as much as it finds one. Right? Like all of us in this chat room today that I'm sure from all different, sorry, the police are outside, from all different spaces and places and ways of thinking about things, we're constituted together here for this moment. So I think that's exciting. And so I don't tend to think a lot about audience when I write. I'm what could be perhaps a little bit useful right? And that's all very, I think a lot about like the smallness of what I can do with a written text. So it might be able to make a really small intervention. It might be able to like help someone explain to someone else something that they couldn't explain before. It might help us think together something that isn't in the book, but it like kind of helps us get there, right? I think that those are some of the things that I think about, like my own writing at least. And you know, a lot, and thinking about Overkill, a lot of what I'm trying to do in the book writ large is work through, again, without the fantasy of a final word, what it might mean to put into representation that which lives beyond representation, right? So writing is a form of representation, just like any other form of representation. And so, you know, that really delicate, perhaps deeply ambivalent space that I keep returning to throughout the book of like, should I be doing this? And I'm still not sure many years later, right? I started writing this book 20 years ago. So that's how long it was. That's why some of the examples are very old. And so, you know, but so that's the larger view of the project. But in particular, the overkill part was actually the first thing I wrote. Like that chapter was an article a long time ago when I was a graduate student. I wrote that. And overkill. So how the project started is it was like the early 2000s, and you know, I, like many other people, had noticed this never-ending archive of trans and queer and gender non-conforming people that had been murdered, but in the ways in which they were murdered was really specific, right? And so there wasn't, and still is not, and should not be, a kind of national archive collecting up all this information, right? So it was just like, and back then it was like almost before the internet. So it was like newspaper articles or magazine articles. And so I was noticing these patterns that pointed towards the pageantry of these murders. And what that did is showed me that thinking them together, they meant something more than just their individuality, right? There's something there, some sort of like meaning making or epistemological project that also accompanied with the direct murders, right? So it was about murdering that person, but actually about murdering the possibility of that kind of life. So both those things. And so overkill is actually a legal term, or a semi-legal term that would appear in some of the literature because of the intensity of these scenes. And so, you know, I thought reading it backwards, right? I wasn't like interested in the specificity of what constituted overkill within the courts. Like it wasn't that, but I was interested in like, what is this doing? What is this saying? That there's all these really intense similarities in these really different locations, these different people, right? They're not like, it's not like people are copying each other, but there's something more about the culture itself that is not only allowing this, but mandating it. Right. And so that's what that first chapter is, an attempt to think about those sets of contradictions.
Eric, can we stay with something that I think you're bringing forward here by way of Anais's questions, which is, well, I want to just highlight something you said, which is how thinking about how projects, the written text, how a book can produce an audience at the same time that it may or may not project one. So there's that, right? So the written word in whatever form it takes can act as a cultivating practice, and often in unexpected ways, I think, or at least for some people, it's unexpected. You know, the point that you made about how the main activity that you've done with your book has been in these study group formats. I think that says a lot, especially in a relatively recent period in which I think that the study group praxis as a form of collective activity is actually proliferating. And in most ways is demonstrating, in an abolitionist sense, the obsolescence of the university. That you do the best of what you do. And I'm talking to people who are employed at universities as faculty and so forth and so on, that you do the best of what you do most likely in spite of the university rather than because of it. And then there's these little examples, not little examples, actually proliferating, lots of proliferating little examples, which means they're actually really fucking big examples, you know, of collective study. For example, I think we're kind of trying to perform that here. So there's something about that that is really important about what you said. But I also, maybe I can interject here and ask you a question about the work of archive, or let me call it the praxis of archive, okay? Because what I appreciate about your response is that on the one hand, you're pushing back against the kind of the conventional attachment, disciplinary, academic, et cetera, attachment, colonial attachment to archive as a form of capture, a form of compartmentalization, you know, a form of really concealing and privatization, and extraction, right? All those things. And then on the other hand, and this is echoing the last book that we're going to be reading in this sequence, which is Damien Sojourner's book on Black Archive. On the other hand, what you're thinking about, or you're making me think about, is how a project like this is actually, in my mind, is actually facilitating an archival or archiving, like in the active sense of the verb, right? An archiving praxis. So have you thought about it this way? Because I feel like it's there. I feel like it's really present from the opening pages of the book. And shoot, like it led us right to the Vimeo, like it led us to the video, right? Like we actually took in Sylvia giving that speech, right? So it's like, this is a moment that is really formative, and it's disruptive, right? In the way that you frame it, is like the lived inconsistencies, which is this anarchist conception that you can't, the whole point was that you can't fix the identity and the position. But this active work of archiving, do you think about this in the context of this project or some of your other work as well?
I mean, yes, I guess. It's like, so if people don't know, I'm trained in a very interdisciplinary program that like does not have any of, yeah, it was very wacky. And so, you know, the question of archiving has always been kind of in the background of what I've done. Although I don't think I went to a single actual real life archive for this project. I mean, right, because it didn't exist or it wouldn't exist. So that's part of it, right? And I was also really like weary of the very possibility of, you know, attempting to fashion some sort of, you know, even if it's incredibly preliminary narrative space that might be called an archive of these forms of violence, right? Because of course, archiving, as we well know, is always a kind of colonial institution that's built through necessarily exclusion, right? You're deciding more what's not in the archive than what is in the archive. And, you know, being who I am in the world, you know, I'm always looking around the edges and looking for some kind of trouble. So I'm always like, what, you know, what might necessarily always fall outside of the archive? Like that's kind of where I stay throughout the book. So like, you know, some people might call it like minor histories or something like that. Yeah, and so, you know, at the same time, the book does, you know, inevitably form some form of like place that people can point towards that has some collection of things, right? An archive. So, you know, and people might see this if you read some of the book, is that I also tend to work in this way where I'll write something and then I'll write myself into a corner and then I'll try to like write myself out of it. And a lot of times I'll just be like, well, I guess we're just in this corner. You know, and there's a lot of, I'm imagining many people in this chat understand themselves to be writers in some way, and there's lots of like easy tricks that people can do, and they always really annoy me. Like one from the 90s is you know, you have like 4 chapters where everything's bad, and then the 5th chapter is about art, and that's going to save us or something like that. There's a lot of that. Dylan's from the 90s too, so he's laughing. You know, it's like, I love art, it's not that, but it's like, you know, instead of like saying like bad, 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 good, there's like a format that happens. And so I'm always trying to like weave them together and actually see what, yeah, and trying to trouble that, right? So it's like the archive, the method, and even what constitute as like an object of study, and like who counts as theorists, right? Like how are we gonna like hold all those and like kind of messy tension, I guess.
Yeah, I know throughout the 90s we'd get in trouble if everything was just fucking bad. It's like, no, we're in this corner. we're all in this corner. We're in a bunch of different corners, and it's all just bad. There's nothing good. Let's just sit in the corner. That's the Eric I know. That's how we get to know. That's how we got to know each other, I think. Let me ask one of our other co-facilitators to come forward, because Allison had some really brilliant insights and an important question around redress. But Allison, whatever you want to bring up would be great.
Hi, Eric. Thanks so much for coming. Your book has been really amazing. Like, I'm thinking through like legislative state violences, and then reading your book like really helped unlock a lot of things in my head. And so what you said about you wanting your book to, lend vocabulary, I think really came to life for me. Um, I guess I have kind of like maybe like impossible questions for you to answer. When you said representing like the unrepresentable, I was like, oh yeah, that's basically what I'm about to ask you to do. But yeah, I guess I was curious about redress, justice. Your book is so much about showing us like the atmospheres of state violence, like how deep in it that we really are, and especially all these like liberal narratives that convolute what's really happening. And I was wondering if you could expand on, what redress looks like for you outside of the law. Um, and I guess I'm more interested in like what the parameters for you are, and like for you in considering like a real redress, right? Like I'm thinking of like Ruth Wilson Gilmore too, and like how she helps us think about like abolition. And I'm curious if you have like a similar way that you kind of think through these terms to kind of get at a better world or life for trans queer people, and honestly all of us. And I'm also curious if, as you're answering this, how your methodology of like reading through a series of violent images, like all these, terrible stories that must have been a huge emotional toll for you to like go through and write, like what a labor, um, how that sifting through like got you there, I guess, like thinking about what does redress really look like and entail for all of us.
All y'all got such good questions. I feel like I'm in a QE. I'm in trouble. Y'all are narrating it much better than I can. So redress. I mean, I think that for me, it might be like an issue of scale, which always feels somewhat inadequate, I think, but I'm probably necessarily staying with those inadequacies. And so what that means, that's like a funny way of saying what I'm going to say. I think that the world that constitutes the archive of this book and many archives of many other books and many worlds must be destroyed if any of us are going to survive. So I think that's number one. And I believe that in my bones. And so how do you act in the world? What do you do? Right? That contradiction. And so that's what leads me to scale. So not surprising, I am not so involved in policy or any of those kinds of things. Although people do, and I have friends, it's not like that, but it's not where I go, right? And so I go to much smaller practices like tent drives for homeless people, people sleeping outside. Like I am always like taking the really big evils and trying to figure out how to act in pretty small ways, because I think that that's actually all we can do. And it is oftentimes the most important. Yeah. And so, I'm always trying to flip the conversation back onto like these really, really, really basic principles of like, housing, food, shelter, like all those things, and kind of taking this big abstraction in this book and like putting it materially in practice, and like the everydayness of like getting some money and then redistributing tents in the Tenderloin, then doing it again, then doing something else like that. So that's like how I think about it theoretically, and then how it materializes in my actual world, which you wouldn't really get any of that from reading this book, right? Because it's like they're kind of separate. And so, obviously the book doesn't as Dylan was saying, doesn't move towards the idea that there's the possibility of salvation, which we all want so bad because things are so horrible. And that can look like a lot of different things, right? That can look like policy, that can look like elected leaders, that can look like, we know all the stories. And so that's what kind of leads me towards the last chapter, or the coda, the ungovernable. Not because I'm naming anything new. All I was attempting to do was describe practices that people have always been engaged in, right? That's the best I can do towards the illusion of an answer, is naming something that's already happening. Like once I start, writing a 10-point program or prescriptions for the world, like we're all in trouble. So like, I'm not that kind of person. But yeah, so looking towards examples that people have and continue to do to get by in a world that wishes that they not, right? And they're all around and they're everywhere, right? And I'm not trying to like blow up someone's spot or something like that. So, that's the other subtext of this book and this other project I'm working on right now. Like, how much should or could be shown and how much should we keep for ourselves? Like, I think about that a lot. And I'm working on this new project about like armed trans and queer people, or like armed leftist groups in the 1970s, 1980s. And so that's like a whole other set of problems around this specific issue. But I think it's still here as well, right? Like, pointing towards Marcia's kind of critique of new forms of visibility also calls new forms of, harm, right? And so like how much, I don't know. So it's something I try to think with, and so redress might be too big of a word for me in this book. I think I can open up a lot of things, but I don't think I can like thread the needle or whatever the right thing is. And I think that to me, that's my ethical stance, is making it less easy to thread the needle.
I'm going to hold on to a question or thought I had about anarchism as method, but let me just kind of implant that now, because I want to come back to it later, because I'm interested in how you think through that, especially in relation to Fanon. But of the fourth of our four co-facilitators is Bren, and Bren had something that they were going to think about alongside the existing stream of discussion, including around biopolitics, but some other stuff. So Bren, just bring forward whatever you wanted to think about there.
Hey, Eric. Thanks for coming in and having this talk. It's a great discussion. And I've really appreciated like everybody else's like insight. I feel like it's helping me like process this book as like a notoriously slow processor of thought. But I was thinking something that like really stood out to me was like um the idea of like biopolitics in terms of like the biopolitics of the cellular or the biopolitics of blood. And then also like the racialized sexuality of blood. I found like this whole section really interesting, and thinking about like kind of the interiority and how the interior is then racialized like through blood. And then was also thinking kind of in my discussion about the like most recent Olympics and how like testosterone was used in the Olympics and previous Olympics to like justify like exclusion in sport. So I guess it's like keeping to that like idea of biopolitics and blood. And then also I liked Dylan's kind of like provocation too to this of like the merging of biopolitics and like ungovernability. And kind of like what I guess like something now that I'm thinking about with that like question is, what is like the ungovernability of like the cellular, or like how would you like kind of merge the ungovernability of blood or the cellular is something I'm thinking about now. I don't know if that even makes sense, but
Well, thank you. I'm teaching this intro to LGBT studies class, and I just tried to teach that chapter to like 100 first year students. It's very funny. But they brought up a lot of interesting questions, so I'm going to try to tie that in, teaching it to this set of questions. So, in that chapter, I guess so. The first chapter opens with a discussion of what would kind of collectively be understood as forms of violence, right? It's like pretty apparent. But I was, equally interested, or perhaps even more interested, in how are the same intensities of force at play when they're not expected to be there, right? So we could look at something like a blood bank. We could look at like the long history of the segregation of blood banking, of refrigerator technologies in post-World War II. I mean, you have to like learn all these things to get there, that were really interesting along the way. And what that helped me think about is, the racialized sexualization of the interiority, both real and imagined, of bodies, right? That it doesn't just live on the skin, as some people might assume, right? So there's like these very material, long racist practices that still are ongoing around this particularly unique substance of blood, right? It signifies beyond itself in ways that lots of things don't. We can go back through many religious texts and find it through lots of different traditions, and then, again, to more contemporary like worries around the blood donation, those kinds of things. And at the time that I was writing that, like biocapital, or the insertion of the biological or the assumed biological into capitalist modes of production, like that kind of conversation was kind of fairly lively. That was maybe like 10 years ago or something like that. And then so there's that in the more academic front, and then the Immoral Life of Henrietta Lacks was published, and that was like a big, white people couldn't eat that book up and fast enough. It was like very that kind of a thing. It was like on all the bestsellers lists. So there's that discussion on the other hand. And I was interested in what forms of accumulation, like violent accumulation, happen even in death, right? And also to that end, how might we expand the kind of category of the labor to the scale of the cellular, right? Like when do you stop working? If your cells are reproducing in an NIH refrigerator bank in Bethesda, Maryland, 100 years after, or 50 years after you're dead. Right. And this, of course, is not lost on any of us, that these forms of accumulation and abstraction actually name some of the largest sectors of the speculative economy, right? It's hundreds of billions of, it's too much money to count. Yeah, and so I think that thinking, through and sometimes against, to kind of get to your question, sorry, I'm going around a long way of getting there, to thinking through and sometimes against older formulations, of the biological or biopower, to biocapital, with an attention towards not just the demand to make, live, or let die, but the kind of co-termination of both of those things in the scene of HIV R&D, research and development, really. Yeah, and so it was like all of those things were in my mind, and I was seeing them, and really it all started because I was at Asian Pacific Islander Wellness Center, and my boyfriend at the time was getting his blood drawn, and I was like, where does it all go? That's like actually what started it. And then I went on this wild chase for many, many years, asking everybody I could, like throughout HIV services, up to, I called the people that run that reagent bank, the person that runs it, and I couldn't use it because I didn't have the rights to it. But I was like, where does this go? And she was like, I have no idea. She was like, I was like, where does this come from? She was like, there's no way to tell. And I was like, really? Don't you work there? And so the inability to tell became a kind of pedagogical step for me to understand again the impossibility of knowing, right? Those levels of abstraction. So yeah, that's where all that came from, right? And again, kind of in a turning towards forms of violence that don't look like violence on the surface, right?
There was a question that Susie had that I'm going to ask her to bring forward around also around second order displacements. I'm going to ask Susie to go, and then in the queue I'm going to go Susie, Adelie, Corinne, I hope I pronounced her name right, Brianna, and then Alina. That might bring us to the end, but we'll see. So just keep raising your hands or keep shooting me a DM if you want to be in the queue.
Should I leave it up or?
No, you can take your hand off. Yeah. And yeah, these are great questions. So y'all are actually shutting me up, which is hard to do. Go ahead, Susie. Bring up the double display. Yeah, bring that second order thing.
Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for your book. It really made me think about like what it means to bring your mind to the edge of I don't want to say despair, but like the necessity of trying to give up hope. Like to like let go of all the things that we don't want to, that give us like this sense of safety, like democracy or inclusion or like progress or all these terms. And I think that what your book does very quickly is kind of brings, through Marcia and Sylvia and through all the stories that you look at, really brings us to the edge of that and says, and I really appreciate that you're like, no, this is actually extremely harmful to the most vulnerable people. And if you keep talking about that, if you keep saying those things, and but then you say, by the end of the intro, like how are we going to imagine? Like the imagination of it is so important. So like a lot of it, I feel like I could see you being like, this is a story you tell yourself, and how is it harming like the most vulnerable people? And so there was one section in the intro where you talked about Sylvia, and then she showed a video of the scene where she's yelling at people and she's telling like, she's like, she's basically like, fuck you, like you with your respectability politics put me in danger, allow me to be beaten, me and my friends, where have you all been? You get to be safe, and we're here. But then there was this sentence, and I don't want to be the annoying person, but I am being the annoying person reading the author back their work. So here I am. But it starts off with, and this I totally understood, in response to these historical and ongoing forms of degradation, which include the booming whiteness and gender normativity of what consolidates under the sign LGBT history, Marcia and Sylvia have been revived as emblematic of a trans of color politic from Stonewall to the current moment. So that I also understood, like the whole idea of like putting people on a pedestal, like saying that they're like the icon of revolution, and we should follow them. I was like, okay, you're saying like that is also another story we're telling ourselves, right? Tell me if I'm wrong, that this is also bullshit. But then your next sentence, I literally wrote at the corner, I was like, what does this mean? And it said, while important, this vital recovery, which I'm thinking you're saying of Marcia and Sylvia, like how, who they are, performs a second order displacement by solidifying their identities, which were in practice constantly lived in beautiful inconsistency. I think the second order displacement kind of like threw me as a term. And then it says imposing a more current identity. And are you saying, like, Dylan helped me kind of think through this, is our aspiration of who they should be on a subject of history is part of the trouble, a trouble we can never avoid as we account for specificity and also for tendencies. Okay, so this part I really didn't understand. As we account for specificity and also for tendencies of recurrence that build beyond themselves. What did you mean for as we account for specificity and also for tendencies of recurrence that build beyond themselves?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sometimes people read things back to me and I'm like, I don't, who wrote that? Who did this? Who wrote this mess? Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think to your estimation of what I was attempting to do in those long run-on sentences, was exactly what you're saying, right? So Sylvia and Marsha in particular get excluded from LGBT history, right? I'm putting all this in quotation marks, the LGBT history thing, right? And then let's say 10 years ago, they get brought back in as the emblematic ideal, right? The story I tell about this is that you could buy 5 years ago you could buy the same picture that I use in the All Power to the People picture of Marsha, you could buy on a t-shirt at Target. But what Target couldn't handle was that she was smoking, so the cigarette is blurred, which I think is so fascinating. And this like isn't about them as people, right? It's about the demand to empty them of what they thought and disappear them as theorists of the world, so that they just become blank objects that anyone can project anything they want onto them, right? Good or bad or whatever. Yeah. So that thing happened. And then the second part, so given that, right? So we don't want to like hyper idealize anybody, because that's how we get into this problem, right? Because the only way we can do that is by erasing the specificity of how they experience the world, right? If they're theorists of the world, then we have to like understand it within the context that they're writing, organizing, doing, fighting, whatever the things they're doing. Right. And so we have to understand that. And at the same, so the problem that I'm trying to get at is how do we think about radical specificity and generality? Like, how do we make a claim without just describing every second of everything? Right. And then what's lost in that process between moving from the hyper specific to the generalizable, right? And instead of just like saying like, yeah, so like, how can we do that without understanding like their problems with each other and with other people, like the messiness of living a life, right? Instead of just turning them into like these perfect examples of a revolutionary spirit, right? So it's how to get from the specific to the general, which is something like I turn to again and again, right? Because it's like an easy move, right? We could just say like X, Y, and Z, and then we're free or something like that. And so I'm always trying to be to propose something, then show how that proposal is inadequate, I guess.
Would you say that this is a problem in the structure of narrating history?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's yes, definitely that. And so, I mean, I think the recursivity of history, like that's how I think history actually works. Like it goes forward and backwards, and it picks up some other stuff and it flips it upside down. Like, yeah. So that's what that part. I mean, I think it's narrating history, but I think it's, you know, understanding the world writ large. I mean, it's actually at like the level of semiotics or something like that. So yeah. But yeah, definitely around history.
That's really helpful to this, particularly the thing that you said about empty vessel. It reminds me of this quote that people used to say about Dr. King, actually, where it's like, now that he is safely dead, let us praise him. You know, like now that we can kind of reify him in the past, he can be whatever it is that we want. And we just can kind of remember them in different ways. But thank you so much.
I'm trying to be a good facilitator because I totally forgot that Mel had a brilliant point to raise as well as at the level of being a practitioner. So I want to make sure I get all these folks' questions and thoughts in. So let me do that facilitator thing where I cheat and I ask two people to present their thoughts together, kind of back to back, and then Eric, you can just riff on it however you wish. So let me ask Adelie and Corinne to come off mute. And Adelie, let me start with you.
Okay, really quickly. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate your book and the panel, the discussion. I'm enjoying it. Just to locate myself, I am US, but I live in New Zealand. But I wanted to locate myself because I'm from the South. So I appreciated the cases that you brought forth, the Mississippi, Alabama, and I also graduated from the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. And so I think I went to that place that you talked about. So I really appreciate you bringing in this Southern rural context, which I think these types of discussions don't have. But my really quick question, I dabble in a gambit, and I remember when I first came across near life, and I wrote this whole page of like, what's near life as opposed to bare life? And then, of course, you explain it really well further down after I've written all these notes. But I noticed when you talk about near life, and I love the way you compare with Agamben's conceptualization of bare life, that you say near life is outside the law, and the condition for Agamben is that the law affirms the rights or that it can happen. And so my question is, with regard as I'm writing this, and I'm loving the way that you're describing near life, and I'm getting it. As a matter of fact, questioning my own work. So thank you. So I think my whole article is wrong now, but thank you for that. But and I was thinking about how you talk about this precarity of survival. And as I posed to the group, I was thinking about, I just talked about slavery and disability, and how disability was a condition of Blackness and anti-Blackness before disability was a thing, like the maiming of bodies and things. And so I was wondering, when you talk about this near life, you don't bring up disability a lot, but when people are pushed, the homelessness, the prison, that it gives rise to this brokenness of these bodies. Even when we talk about something like gentrification, we talk about the class displacement, but we don't think about how gentrification breaks bodies, that you enter into these enterprises to survive. And so how important do you think, when we begin to talk about teasing out, I think it's important the way you explain your life and how you link it to happening outside the law. In other words, I'm assuming you're saying that looking to the law to correct this will not work, right? And so, but how much do you think disability play a role in how, in this community that is sort of like with slavery and anti-Blackness, almost a condition that these bodies will be broken? Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Adelie. Corinne, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, Corinne.
Yeah, you're good. Yeah. Hi. My name's Corinne. I write about anti-Asian racism. But Eric, thank you so much for being here. I really love the book. And I guess my thoughts sort of centered. So Dylan had asked this question, or had primed us with this question last class, and was like, you know, think about the things in the books that fuck with you, right? And so I was like, all right, what about this book fucks with me? And like, one of the things that I really appreciated were these moments where you would read to get together, right? Seemingly, I guess you would read things in like non-traditional ways, right? Like in chapter 1, where you were talking about, I think the way, I think it's Gay Shame, and their poster, and they sort of call both Akbar and I'm going to mess up the name, but Arujo queer. And reading them sort of together in this unexpected way, even if that's not how both of them would like self-identify. And then also this other moment earlier, I think in the introduction, where you get to, you know, you center Fanon as this sort of like anchoring point. And I, you know, was immediately, I was like, oh, I wonder what's going to go on with this weird footnote that Fanon has. And you get to this footnote with Fanon on, you know, cross-dressing, and you're talking about Fanon as this sort of source for queer and trans study. And so it kind of goes against like the traditional, like what you would expect somebody to be like, oh yes, here's where, you know, Fanon is like replicating these, you know, heteronormative or whatever cisnormative ideas. And so all of that was really interesting to me, because then you pose this question, how does the impasse become yet another door? And I really appreciated that, because it reminded me of a couple of moments, one of them being in Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, where he says something like, we should leave methodologies to the scientists and math, or the botanists and mathematicians, or something like that. And then also Christina Sharp's ideas about becoming undisciplined. And so the way that, like, you know, I don't know, like colonial and academic knowledges discipline us to think about methodology and approach in, you know, a particular way. And, you know, I'm thinking about this together with the conversation in your book about the pitfalls of recognition, which, you know, also entails, right, the pitfalls of legibility and transparency, and with it representation. And so writing is a form of representation, but, you know, also maybe in ways that are, or can be ungovernable, like thinking about methodologies that are ungovernable. Can they be ungovernable? Can they disorder our ideas about the world? Because academia has this way of sort of socializing us and disciplining us to fetishize epistemological certainty and transparency and consistency, and these very formulaic methods, and these very, you know, you read these types of sources, you know, only when they're all legal sources, or only when they're all centering, you know, these people who identify in the same, or something like that. And so I guess I appreciated how you throw those things into crisis, or throw those things into question, and read together things in unexpected ways. And I would love for you to just talk a little bit more about, you know, how you thought about that. Did it feel like at a certain point that it was an impasse, and then that's what forced you to read them together in these ways, or, you know, so on and so forth. So, yeah, I'll stop there, but yeah.
Great, thank you both. I'll try to think with you two together, these questions together, or these provocations. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, obviously disability is like a major structuring concept that I work throughout the book. I mean, it doesn't look like some forms of disability studies, but it's obvious. I mean, it's obviously there in every page. And I mean, the way that I'm thinking about it, or I should back up a little bit. So my critique, and you know, I think you got this totally right, of Bare Life is, you know, he works that as a kind of stripping down of legal personhood to its biological function, right? So we could say that. I mean, and for people that haven't read, like in a footnote, in a condensed version, that's what it is, right? Right, and so that sent me through like reading like the formation of the Prussian constitutions. I mean, I was like going way back in like all these wild directions, right? So how we'd get there. And what I was actually interested in is paragraph 175 of the Prussian constitution, which became the Nazi constitution, which became the post-unification constitution, which left queer people and transferred queer people from concentration camps to prisons, right? And there's lots of interesting interviews with survivors and like what we might think as a break. And, you know, if ever there was evidence of Germany's, you know, fourth, fifth, sixth Reich, you know, we could look at it right now. So what we might think as a break, right? What Agamben understands as a kind of break with the liberation of the camps, right? In what ways do the camps go on? Both theoretically, but actually material, like the same people just get moved on a bus, or some of them stay in the same camps because a lot of the camps become prison, where prison camps became concentration camps, became prison camps again, right? And lots of other right? So paragraph 175 criminalized homosexuality. And so lots of other quote unquote criminals get left too. So it's not just this, but it wasn't, you know, it's one of those things that makes you, like for those who existed without even a claim to legal personhood pre the kind of, you know, proliferation of the Nazi constitution, like what then, right? So again, became one of those ways for me to think about this other form of parasociality that might live adjacent to, it's like not against that concept or whatever, it's just kind of adjacent to it, I guess. Yeah, and so I think that there's that. And then I think, yeah, you're, you know, it's also like how we think about disability, you know, obviously about in some instantiations as lack, but also as not lack, right? So like we don't know in advance how that's going to show up. You know, that seems important to me. And, you know, we can think about is the ways that, you know, in my life, at least, you know, one of the most formative groups of disability organizing is, of course, ACT UP. And it oftentimes it falls out of the narrative, which I think is really fascinating. But, you know, I think, you know, what they did, you know, with the Ashes Action in particular, and bringing, you know, the bodies of their dead to the house of the executioner, as they saw it, which was the White House. I mean, it's like a very intense, powerful space to think with all these questions around debility, disability, limits of body and bodily autonomy in a, you know, like you're saying, an anti-Black, racist, ableist world, like all that. Yeah, so thank you for pointing that out and helping me think more about that. Yeah, and I mean, the question of method or methodology, like it's always a joke, but I'm like, it also is just true. Like, I never really even took like a class that wasn't a discipline ever. I did most of my undergrad at City College and community college. So I did some there, but like when I was in elementary school, when I was in undergrad and graduate school, I just never did. And so what I think that did do in a positive sense is I learned about disciplines through their critiques mostly. And it authorized me in a certain sense, which I think is a kind of privilege, but is a privilege everyone should have, to not really worry about it and pull together the things that are pulling you together and write with them and stay with them because it feels kind of right. And that's where all of our work, I think, kind of starts, whatever it is. It's kind of like it feels right or something, or there's something here that we're trying to put together. Yeah, and so I didn't have, luckily, I think for myself, I didn't have a kind of methodological imposition that I had to necessarily follow, nor do I even know how to do it. My students were like, can you do this IRB thing? I'm like, I don't even know what that is. It's true. And those are all fine, but that's just like not actually how I work. And yeah, so I think that it's about the kind of actual pragmatics of how I was trained, but morally it's really just like about my general view of the world. Like if someone tells me to do something, I'll just be like no and go the other direction. It's like my general bad attitude is probably my method. Yeah, so I think that on that question is not exactly that useful, but if anything, I would say like if you're feeling really strongly about something, some things that need to be held together, they probably do. And, us as theorists or writers or whatever, musicians, all those kinds of things, like, how are we going to make those connections enough so that maybe someone else can get it? Yeah.
I mean, yeah, what you're pointing out is this a permeable distinction between method and experiment. Or sorry, I don't mean experiment, experimentation as a kind of permanent way of thinking and of thought. And also, and Eric, I don't want to let this go unstated. I think a lot of what animates your approach and the ways you were just talking about it, as you're half jokingly saying it's fueled by a bad attitude. Yeah, you have a really bad attitude. That's why I love you. But it's also coming from a collective position, right? So it's not just Eric. It's a bad attitude that is animated by so many other people who righteously, in a principled way, have a really horrible fucking attitude because there's no other attitude to have toward this civilization, right? So I think there's something about that also comes from going through coursework and teachers who are not situated in the traditional academic so-called disciplines, because I think there's much more of a possibility, many more threads of kind of epistemic and what we call method or methodological insurrection against a certain order. Enough of me. Let me ask Brianna and Alina to go next, and we'll close with Mel. We may go a little over our time limit, but we won't go much over. So Brianna, why don't you go first, and I'll go to Alina.
Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Brianna. I use she, her pronouns. I want to say thanks for the space. It's nice to see some folks again. I did put my question/paragraph in the chat. It's half-baked, so I'm going to try and rephrase it. I'm interested in the question around methodology and trying to imagine if maybe this is an invitation to imagine what kinds of tools and boundaries would we have to have in place, or at least start reconsidering from today moving forward, if this is about deciding if this world is untenable. So ungovernability is a kind of praxis, but I also have a theoretical question. So for me, the book is a confirmation that legal violence, the scope of it, is linked with sexual terror because both sustain the aesthetic, corporeal, material, and political regimes of anti-Blackness. And abolition then is about the destruction and creation of particular kinds of values, and I'll put an asterisk because values a weird word for me in the context of Blackness. But I would bring back the way that you talk about Black Fresh, highlighting why we need to hold on to incommensurability, and what the bridge work of it is, if it's, you say, through harm's persistence. If ontology has a Blackness problem and this scope is affecting every intimate part of our lives, then what kinds of boundaries or what are we refusing to continue doing is what I'm asking. What kinds of things would we have to start teaching one another and ourselves as a kind of toolkit in a more practical way? So what kinds of things do you think we would have to reconsider given that sexual terror and law are enmeshed? Like, how do you end people's values?
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you. It's really good. Alina, go ahead. Ask it. Oh, here.
Okay. Hello, Eric. So oh, okay. There's an echo. Okay, so I'm a master's student in the history department, and I actually work on blood and contemporary art. So your text was very insightful to me. Um, that I even put it on my thesis bibliography. But what I wanted to ask you is about violence on queer bodies, because a lot of the artists that I'm interested in, for example, Catherine Opie and Ron Athey, they utilize a lot of like self-mutilation, and it's also done in the space of kind of S&M practices. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on like self-inflicted violence, if it could be a kind of a powerful tool? But also, I've noticed that most of the artists that engage in these practices are white. So I don't know, I wanted to hear your thoughts on this whole idea. And yeah, that's basically my question.
Cool, thanks, y'all. Guess I'll try to think with the first one, that really important set of questions that you raised, like you know, what do we need to learn, what do we need to unlearn, what do we need to do, what do we need to not do. I mean, I think that given, as you really importantly stated, the kind of foundational work of anti-Blackness, which is also to say sexualized, and sexual terror, which is also to say anti-Blackness, like how do we think those? So is that a good paraphrasing of what you're asking? Just make sure.
Uh,
If
yeah,
not, let me know. It's just,
I would say yeah. I'm interested in like the physiological, I call it a physiopolitical compass, because the issue is both how it's wired in your body, but it's also political and it's also material. So like what then becomes the organizing principle to locate and like name the violence that you're talking about, but then end it and bridge
yeah.
between these things. Yeah.
I mean, I think that for me, right, I can't even begin to assume how we might end it without a simultaneous deep description of it, right? And I think that that's like kind of what I'm hearing in your work as well, like the way that those things need to be constituted together, because oftentimes it's the other way around, right? The kind of way that we usually are taught to understand violence is like, this is how you end it, but we don't actually, we fundamentally don't understand what it is, right? And how it's working on various planes. And right, that not knowing, of course, is how violence continues. And so for me, I think that I guess the way I would attempt to answer this question is returning to a previous part of the conversation around the way that hope and non-hope live together. Right, because it's also about like, how do we live with the intensity of this unfolding reality and still do something together. And also in terms of experimentation, like trying things that are probably not going to work, and that's okay, right? My joke about organizing is every single thing I've ever done for the last 35 years of organizing has failed. Every single thing, every which direction. But like, I don't take that on, right? It then in turn becomes a kind of an instructor that allows me to think how we might, with other people, do something differently next time, right? Yeah, so I think that the coterminacy of description and action are necessary, right? That's something that Ruth Wilson Gilmore always leads us towards. And I find it really necessary, right? Returning to the idea that started our whole conversation around, the place of study, of collective study in particular, right? Everything that might be vaguely even a little bit useful or interesting in this book came from my relationships with other people, mostly through organizing, right? Because what organizing doesn't let me do is tell simple stories that are all lies, right? I could be like, oh, we need this person, or like, oh, this person has the answer. And then that person, then you're like, oh, that person, and so, I return to that moment. And it's, again, I'm not sure. And I would be scared of myself if I assumed to have an answer for you that probably met, I would be much more interested in knowing what you think and what you all think about, where to go and what to do, than assuming that I necessarily know anything about that. So maybe after this, then if you want to give us some thoughts, that would be very cool, because I would love to know more. And then the question of, yeah, I mean, art and artists. I mean, I think that, via Fanon, one of the arguments that I'm attempting to make is, that we are existing in a field of, a state of total war, in a field of violence itself, right, as a kind of pedagogical space. And so I think what people are doing or not doing with their bodies, like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if that even resides in the conversation of violence. I don't know. Like, I'd have to actually think more about it. But yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of that work is really interesting. Of course, especially a lot of Ron Athey's earlier work was really about like the fear of HIV and all that kind of stuff, and blood. And so it has there's a lot of resonances here, but I haven't actually specifically thought about, and Kathy Opie's as well, their work in particular around these questions. But I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it. So, it's definitely not my specialty, but I think there's a lot there and a lot to think with. So,
this is my kind of seminar study group.
Dylan, your sound is kind of wacky now.
How's that? Is that better? That better? No, this is my kind of group. This is my kind of thinking. Is where we refuse the definitive, foreclosed, formulaic agenda as the answer. Let's ask Mel. Do you think, Mel, you could bring us home today by raising the question that you brought forward as a practitioner?
Yeah, of course. Number one, Eric, I wanted to say that I loved your book. I am a mental health therapist. I've been a therapist for 20 plus years now. And I just found it so validating to hear about just the connection between Fanon and how, like, the section on suicide in particular, because I think suicide is often like so pathologized as the individual, but it had me really wondering, as I've wondered many times in my career, what does then care look like, or how can care exist, I guess, within mental health? And I'm not assuming that you have all the answers. I'm just curious what your thoughts are, in a way that isn't protecting the state, in essence, in a way that, because I get that, like, I am a symbol of the state, and when somebody's suicidal, we're told we gotta, like, do all this stuff to stop somebody from, just like completing that suicide. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are, because I think that's super important.
That's another, I mean, all these questions, I'm just like, oh gosh, I don't know. Yeah, so I appreciate everyone for being here. I learned a lot from y'all. But so suicide, I mean, I think, so my point of departure is an attempt to create the conditions in which I and our people can continue to live and fight another day, right? At the same time, right, as you're pointing out via Fanon, we know that suicide is, of course, not an individual act, right? It always lives within the context that oftentimes mandates it, right? We might call it murder by another name. There's lots of, revolutionary suicide. There's lots of like ways that we might think about this. And, you know, that chapter was written in the kind of wave of, you know, what people were calling the epidemic of LGBT, mostly like trans-ish young people suicides, right? And people were like, how did this happen? And in my never-endingly bleak fashion, I ask, like, how can this not happen? Right? The miracles that anyone survives. And you can see I'm not a therapist, but my teachers, I mean, my students call me like the most depressing professor they've ever had. But I think that there is a little wiggle room in that if we start there, it actually, even in the therapeutic space, can open up something else, right? And that's what Fanon was doing, right? Because it obviously depersonalizes it and depathologizes it in a way that, you know, again, might open up a little bit of other space to think about, you know, even something as like self or individualistically defined as self-harm as always being collectivized harm. Yeah. And so I think that, again, what I can do is maybe add a little bit to the discursive apparatus around it. What I would do with that, I don't actually know. You know, again, I would always reaffirm that I want people to be able to make it through another day, right? That's, again, my question, the question of scale. That's where I'm always at. Like, you know, how do we get there? Because even in the intensity of impossibility, like there's always possibility, like totalities are always porous. So even in the bleakness that is my the way I describe things, you know, something else could happen, right? And that's really what I get from Fanon. You know, he should not have been, but he's a kind of endlessly, almost romantically optimistic person, even when he's dying of leukemia. You know, in Maryland, not very far from the NIH bank that I write about. Yeah, and so, you know, what does that mean to hold on to the revolutionary possibility even in and as death encroaches us?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate that, y'all. And this closing thought from Mel and Eric just makes me want to express my appreciation for the fact of convening. And Eric, my appreciation for you for convening us in this way. You know, as y'all know, there's a sequence of these convenings, but it just, Eric, you said earlier on about thinking small, you know, in terms of what, so there's a contribution that's made every time there's a convening. And so there's a preciousness to that contribution as well, you know, and so I just want to value that and let's all thank Professor, Doctor, Comrade, insurrectionist, accelerationist, Eric Stanley, for convening us today. Thank you to everyone who is here for this beautiful conversation and sharing your thoughts and the generosity with which everybody's been present. And I apologize for keeping you past our class time by 6 minutes. So hopefully you're not going to get fired from your other jobs or otherwise sacrificing your work. But thank you, everybody. And I hope I'll see everybody next week. Thank you, Eric. I'll text you in a minute. Thank you, everybody. See you next week. Bye, y'all.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you so much.